The dust was a shroud, a constant companion in the valley where Jedediah chose to bury his life. It coated the cross bearing Sarah's name, and the smaller one next to it for Caleb. It settled in the lines of his face, carved there by a grief so profound it had silenced the world. His ranch was a skeleton picked clean by sorrow, the fences sagging like tired shoulders, the well whispering of thirst. Each sunrise was an indictment, another day to be endured. He moved through his chores with the mechanical precision of a man who had forgotten why he was moving at all. The creak of the porch swing, once a sound of evening peace, was now a ghost's lament. He hadn't sat in it since the day he dug the second grave. He was checking the southern fence line, a task as meaningless as any other, when he saw it. Not the broken fence wire he'd been looking for, but a splintered wagon wheel half buried in the arroyo. It looked like a fractured bone jutting from the parched earth. There was no horse, no sign of life, just the wreckage and a silence that felt different from his own. It was a listening silence, taut with fear. His hand rested on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard, a habit born of instinct, not threat. He dismounted, his boot sinking into the soft, hot sand. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked creosote and something else. Desperation. He followed a set of small, shuffling tracks leading away from the wreck, toward a cluster of sun-bleached boulders. That's where he found them. 3 girls, huddled together like a litter of abandoned pups. The oldest, maybe 10 or 11, stood in front of the other 2, a broken piece of a crate clutched in her hand like a weapon. Her eyes, narrowed and fierce, held a darkness that had no place in a child's face. Behind her, a younger girl with wide, haunted eyes clutched the tattered sleeve of an even smaller child, who was so thin and frail she seemed almost translucent. They were dressed in rags that might have once been dresses, their faces smudged with dirt and tears, their bodies trembling not from cold, but from a terror that had become their only skin. Jedediah stopped. He didn't raise his hands in a placating gesture, he knew it would be read as a precursor to violence. He simply stood, a statue of a man against the vast, indifferent sky. The oldest girl's voice was a dry rasp, a sound scraped from the very bottom of a well of courage. Go on. Nothing here for you. He saw the faint, ugly bruise blooming on her cheek, the way the middle child flinched when he shifted his weight. He saw starvation in the hollows of their cheeks and a weariness in their bones that rivaled his own. He slowly unhooked the canteen from his belt. The sound of the sloshing water was obscenely loud in the stillness. He set it on the ground and pushed it forward with the toe of his boot. It stopped a few feet from them. The oldest girl's gaze flickered to the canteen, then back to his face, her suspicion a palpable thing. It was the middle one who spoke, her voice a fragile whisper that the wind nearly stole. Anything left for us? The question wasn't about the water. It was about the world. It was the plea of a soul that had been offered nothing but cruelty and expected nothing more. Jedediah's own grief, a dull, constant ache, sharpened into a blade of pure empathy. He saw his Caleb in their small, fragile forms. He saw his Sarah in the fierce, protective stance of the oldest girl. The silence stretched, a fragile thread between his desolate world and theirs. Finally, he answered, his voice rough from disuse. There's water. He didn't offer comfort, or shelter, or hope. He offered the only thing he was sure he had. The oldest girl, Eliza, watched him, her eyes searching his for the lie, for the price. He saw her glance at the youngest, Tess, whose head was lolling with exhaustion. He saw the internal battle, the surrender of pride to the crushing weight of necessity. She gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The middle child, Mara, scurried forward, snatched the canteen, and retreated back to the huddle. The sound of their gulping, desperate swallows was a prayer and a curse. When the canteen was empty, Eliza looked at him again. And that's when he saw it, coiled deep within the feral defiance of her gaze. It was a fear not of pain, or hunger, or death. It was a fear of hope itself. She was terrified of the possibility that he might be kind, because kindness was a currency she had learned was always paid for later, with interest. He saw eyes that had been taught to see a helping hand as the one that would eventually strike the hardest. A cold dread settled in Jedediah's stomach. This was a wound far deeper than any he could mend with food or water. He turned without another word and walked back to his horse. He swung himself into the saddle and looked back at them. 3 small figures against an endless expanse of rock and dust. He could ride away. He could ride back to his empty house and his silent grief and pretend he had seen nothing. It would be the easy thing to do. It would be the sensible thing. But as he looked at them, he saw the ghosts of his own family, not beckoning him to the grave, but begging him to live. He nudged his horse forward, not away, but back toward them. He stopped a respectful distance away. "The ranch," he said, his voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "There's a roof." Eliza stared at him, her small face a mask of mistrust. She didn't move. He waited. The sun beat down, merciless. Finally, with a visible effort that seemed to cost her everything, she pulled her sisters to their feet. They followed him, a small, ragged procession of sorrow, keeping their distance, their steps tentative, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. They walked toward a home that had forgotten the sound of life, and Jedediah walked ahead of them, a broken savior leading the wounded souls, the silence between them filled with the unspoken fear that this fragile truce was just another stop on a long road to more pain. The ranch house was a testament to suspended animation. Inside, a layer of dust softened the sharp edges of memory. A rocking chair sat motionless by the cold hearth. A child's worn blanket was draped over the back of a sofa. To the girls, it was a palace. To Jedediah, it was a tomb he was now sharing. He directed them to the small bedroom that had been Caleb's. He laid out 3 clean blankets on the floor, not daring to suggest the bed itself, which still held the faint indentation of a boy who would never return. He said nothing, just left the door ajar and retreated to the porch. He sat on the top step, listening. He heard whispers, then the soft scuffing of bare feet on wood. He had left a plate of bread and jerky on the kitchen table. He waited for what felt like an hour before he heard the furtive sounds of them creeping out, snatching the food, and retreating back to their burrow. They were like field mice, cautious and nocturnal. For 3 days, a strange rhythm established itself. Jedediah would rise before the sun, do his chores, and leave food on the table. He never approached their room. He never spoke unless it was a simple, one-word statement. Water or food, he found them watching him from the shadows of the doorway, their eyes following his every move, assessing, judging. Eliza, the eldest, was the sentinel. Her gaze was unblinking, hostile. Mara, the middle one, was the observer. She tracked him with a quiet, unnerving intensity, as if memorizing his patterns. Tess, the youngest, was a ghost. He barely saw her, only catching glimpses of a small, pale face peering from behind her sister's legs. He knew they were testing him. Every meal left untouched for an hour was a test. Every door left unlocked was a test. Every time he passed their room without looking in was a test. He was mending a corral fence on the 4th day, the repetitive motion of stretching wire and driving staples a familiar comfort. He was forcing order onto a small piece of his chaotic world. He felt their eyes on him and glanced toward the house. Eliza and Mara stood on the porch, watching. They had been there for an hour, silent and still. He ignored them, focusing on his work. The hammer rose and fell. A rhythm of repair. He finished the section and turned to get more staples from his steel bag. As he did, he saw it lying on the ground near the porch steps, a small, crudely carved wooden horse. Caleb's. His son had spent a week whittling it, his tongue stuck out in concentration. Jedediah's breath caught in his throat. He'd thought it lost. He walked over, his heart a heavy stone in his chest, and picked it up. The wood was smooth from countless hours in a small boy's hand. He ran his thumb over it, a wave of cold grief washing over him. He looked up at the girls. Eliza's face was defiant, but he saw a flicker of something else in Mara's eyes. Fear? Curiosity? He walked to the porch, placed the wooden horse on the top step, and went back to his work without a word. For the rest of the afternoon, the toy horse sat there, a bridge between 2 worlds of loss. As dust began to bleed across the sky, he saw a small hand dart out from the shadows of the porch and snatch the horse. It was Tess. He saw her for a brief second, clutching the toy to her chest before disappearing back into the house. It was the first time she had willingly come into the light. The next morning, when he left the plate of food, he also left a small tin of peaches he'd been saving. When he came back at noon, the peaches were gone and the empty tin was sitting neatly beside the plate. It was a thank you. It was a truce. That evening, he decided to sit on the porch swing. He moved it just enough to make it creak, a sound he hadn't willingly made in over a year. He sat there, looking out at the fading light, his rifle across his lap. The front door creaked open. Eliza stepped out, her arms crossed, a silent guard. Mara followed, and then, hesitantly, Tess, who clutched the wooden horse in her hand. They didn't come near him. They sat on the far end of the porch, their backs against the wall of the house. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crickets and the slow, rhythmic creak of the swing. He made it, Jedediah said, his voice quiet. He didn't need to elaborate. Eliza's gaze flickered to the horse in Tess's hand. Your boy, she asked. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Jedediah nodded, his throat tight. Caleb another long silence. The darkness deepened, wrapping the small ranch in a blanket of stars. Our pa, Eliza said, her voice hard as stone, he didn't make things. He just broke them. The confession hung in the air, sharp and painful. Jedediah stopped the swing. He looked at her, at the fierce, wounded pride in her eyes, and saw the truth of her words etched in the memory of every bruise she'd ever hidden. My name is Jedediah, he said. It was the first time he had offered them a piece of himself. Eliza considered it, then gave a curt nod. I'm Eliza. That's Mara. And Tess. The introductions were formal, stark. A fragile peace began to settle over the ranch, as delicate as a spider's web. It was shattered a week later by the sight of a lone rider on the horizon, kicking up a plume of official-looking dust. The rider wasn't meandering, he was heading straight for them. Eliza saw him first. She grabbed her sisters and pulled them inside, the screen door slamming shut with a sound like a gunshot. Jedediah stood up, his hand going to the warm grip of the pistol on his hip. He watched the rider approach, a knot of ice forming in his gut. The law had come, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the law was not here to help. Sheriff Brody dismounted with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who enjoyed his own authority. He was thick-set, his face florid and perpetually unimpressed, his badge a small, dull star on a stained vest. He didn't look at the house, but at the newly mended corral fence, a faint, condescending smirk playing on his lips. Heard you had some strays wander onto your property, Jedediah, he said, his voice carrying an easy contempt. He looped his reins around the hitching post and finally turned his gaze to Jedediah, who stood silently on the porch. Jedediah didn't answer. He just watched Brody's eyes scan the property, cataloging, assessing. Brody was a man who saw the world as a series of problems to be managed, not people to be understood. From inside the house, Jedediah could feel the weight of 3 sets of terrified eyes watching through the grimy window pane. 3 girls, Brody continued, taking a step onto the porch. Orphans. From the Miller place over by the flats. Caused a bit of a stir when they ran off. Jedediah's silence was a wall. He shifted his weight, his hand never straying far from his hip. He could smell stale whiskey on the sheriff's breath. The county wants M, Brody said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Got a place for girls like that. An institution. They'll be fed. Clothed. Taught a trade. He said the words without a flicker of conviction. The institution in the next county was a place whispered about in hushed, fearful tones, a brick-and-mortar prison where children's spirits were broken as surely as wild horses. They're fine here, Jedediah said, his voice low and even. Brody chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. That's not for you to decide. The law has a say in these things. They're wards of the county now. He took another step, his presence filling the porch, crowding the air. Besides, he added, his voice dropping conspiratorially, there's another party interested. Man by the name of Silas Kane. Stepfather, I believe. He's got papers. Says they belong to him. The name fell like a stone into a deep well. Inside the house, a small gasp was stifled. Jedediah felt a tremor run through the floorboards, a wave of pure terror emanating from the hidden children. He saw the shadow of Eliza's face at the window, her eyes wide with a horror that was primal. They ain't property, Jedediah said. The words were quiet, but they held the unyielding weight of granite. Sheriff Boldest's smirk faltered. He looked at Jedediah, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not the grieving recluse the town whispered about, but a man planted as deep as the mountains behind him. Don't be a fool, Jedediah. This ain't your fight. Kane's got the law on his side. He's their legal guardian. The law's wrong, Jedediah stated simply. It was not an argument, it was a fact. Boldest's face hardened. I'll be back in 2 days. With Kane. You have them ready. You interfere, and I'll have you in a cell for obstruction before sunset. Understand? He unfolded the paper and slapped it onto Jedediah's chest. A warrant. A piece of paper that gave a monster the right to claim his victims. Brody turned and walked away, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving the warrant and his threat hanging in the suffocating air. Jedediah stood there for a long time, the paper still pressed against his shirt. He heard the door creak open behind him. He didn't turn. He knew what he would see. He felt Eliza's presence at his elbow. Her voice was small, stripped of all its earlier fire, replaced by a chilling, resigned despair. You going to sell us again? The question was a knife in his gut. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry from a child who had been bought and sold, traded and bartered her entire life. She believed this was the natural order of things. She believed his kindness was just a prelude to a transaction. He finally turned to look at her. Mara and Tess were huddled in the doorway behind her, their faces pale with a familiar fear. The fragile trust they had built over the past weeks lay shattered at their feet. He saw the wooden horse, Caleb's horse, lying abandoned on the floor where Tess had dropped it. He looked into Eliza's eyes, eyes that had momentarily dared to hope, and saw that the fear had returned, stronger than ever. It was the fear he'd seen in the arroyo, the fear of hope itself, now fully realized. No, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He crumpled the sheriff's warrant in his fist. No one is selling anyone, but the word sounded hollow, even to him. The threat was no longer a distant shadow, it had a name and a deadline. Silas Kane was coming. Jedediah looked past the girls, through the open door to the cold hearth inside, and then out to the horizon where the sheriff had disappeared. He was one man, on a forgotten ranch, against the law and a monster. The setting sun cast his long shadow across the porch, a lone sentinel guarding a broken home, waiting for the inevitable darkness to fall. The 2 days that followed were a silent, suffocating vigil. The air grew heavy, pregnant with the coming storm. Jedediah worked, but his movements were different. He wasn't just doing chores, he was preparing for a siege. He checked the action on his rifle, the feel of it solid and cold in his hands. He oiled the mechanism of his pistol. He walked the perimeter of his small homestead, not checking fences, but sightlines, positions of cover, places of vulnerability. He was a rancher, not a soldier, but he knew the land. He knew every dip and rise, every cluster of rock that could hide a man, every shadow that could conceal a threat. The girls watched him, their silence a heavy blanket over the house. The tentative peace they had found was gone, replaced by the stark reality of their past clawing its way back to them. Eliza barely ate. She moved like a phantom through the house, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her body coiled tight as a spring. Mara had retreated into herself, her face a pale, unreadable mask. Tess clung to her sisters, the wooden horse a permanent fixture in her small hand, a talisman against the encroaching darkness. On the second evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, Jedediah sat on the porch cleaning his rifle. Eliza came out and stood beside him. She didn't speak for a long time. "He likes to smile when he hurts you," she said suddenly, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He calls it teaching a lesson." Jedediah didn't look up from his work. He kept wiping down the barrel of the gun, his knuckles white. "He told my ma that we were a bad investment. After she died, he tried to sell us to a man who ran a mining camp." Jedediah stopped his work. He looked at her, at this child forced to carry burdens no adult should bear. He saw the ghost of the bruise on her cheek and understood it was just one of a long, painful litany. "He told the sheriff we ran away," she continued, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "We didn't run. He threw us out. Said we were more trouble than we were worth. Left us with that broken wagon and a sack of flour. I think he hoped we'd just disappear." The terrible truth of it settled between them. Cain didn't want them back out of affection or duty. He wanted them back because they were his. His to break, his to discard, his to reclaim at his whim. They were an affront to his ownership. Jedediah set the rifle down. "Why did you ask if I would sell you?" he asked quietly. Eliza finally looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not just fear or defiance, but a profound and shattering weariness. "Because everyone does," she whispered. Sooner or later, before he could answer, a sound carried on the evening breeze. The steady beat of shod hooves. Not one horse, but two. They appeared over the rise, two dark figures silhouetted against the dying light. Sheriff Brody and another man, this one taller, leaner, sitting his horse with an arrogant slump. Silas Cain. Jedediah stood up, picking up his rifle. "Go inside," he said to Eliza. "Bar the door. Stay away from the windows." She hesitated, her eyes locked on the approaching figures. "Go," he repeated, his voice firm. She turned and fled into the house, the door slamming shut behind her. Cain and Brody rode into the yard and stopped just beyond the porch. Cain dismounted with a fluid, almost predatory grace. He was a man who was comfortable in his own skin, handsome in a cruel sort of way, with pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing and value nothing. He smiled, a thin, predatory slash in his face. It was exactly the smile Eliza had described. "Jedediah," Sheriff Brody said, his voice strained. "I told you how this would be. Mr. Cain has come for his children." Cain stepped forward, his eye sweeping over the small ranch house with open disdain. "My stepdaughters," he corrected, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A man has a right to his own family, Sheriff. A responsibility." He looked at Jedediah, his smile widening. "I appreciate you looking after my property, friend. But I'll take it from here." Jedediah's grip tightened on his rifle. "They're not your property. And I'm not your friend." Cain's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. "They are my legal burden. Under the law of this territory. And you are trespassing in a family matter." He took a step toward the porch. "Eliza! Mara! Get out here! Your father's come to take you home." A dead silence answered him from the house. Cain's facade of civility began to crack. His voice took on a sharp, commanding edge. "I won't tell you again, they're not coming," Jedediah said. Cain laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You think you can stop me? An old, broken-down rancher mourning his dead family. I have the law with me." He gestured to Brody, who sat uncomfortably on his horse, his hand resting on his pistol. Jedediah didn't look at the sheriff. His eyes were locked on Cain. "You have a badge with you." "That's not the same thing." He raised the rifle until it was pointing not at Cain's chest, but at the ground just in front of his feet. A line drawn in the dust. "Get off my land." For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Cain's smile vanished completely, replaced by a mask of pure, venomous rage. He looked at Brody. "Sheriff, are you going to let this man threaten me? Do your job." Sheriff Brody shifted in his saddle. "Jedediah, put the gun down. This is your last chance." Jedediah's gaze didn't waver. He was a mountain, immovable. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Then, Cain made his move. He didn't reach for a gun. He lunged for the porch steps. The world exploded into motion. The first shot was not from Jedediah's rifle. It was the crack of Sheriff Brody's pistol, a warning shot fired into the air, a pathetic attempt to assert an authority he had already lost. It was the starting gun for a race to hell. Cain scrambled onto the porch, his face a mask of fury. Jedediah didn't shoot him. He swung the heavy stock of his rifle like a club, a brutal, desperate arc of wood and steel. It connected with Cain's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling back into the dust of the yard. Cain roared, a sound of pure animal rage, and rolled to his feet, pulling a long-barreled revolver from under his coat. Jedediah chambered around, the metallic shick-shack a definitive statement. He wasn't playing by the law's rules anymore. He was playing by his own. From his horse, Sheriff Brody drew a bead on Jedediah. "Drop it, Jedediah! Now!" But his voice was drowned out by Cain's snarl. "Shoot him, you coward! Shoot him!" The front door of the house flew open. It was Eliza, her face pale but resolute. In her hands, she held Jedediah's old, heavy cast-iron skillet. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight at Brody's horse, screaming a wild, incoherent cry of defiance, and swung the skillet with all her might against the horse's flank. The animal shrieked in pain and surprise, rearing violently. Sheriff Brody, caught off guard, tumbled from the saddle, landing hard in the dirt with a grunt. His pistol flew from his grasp, landing near the water trough. Eliza didn't stop. She scooped up a handful of dirt and flung it at Cain's face just as he was raising his pistol. He flinched, momentarily blinded, giving Jedediah the only opening he needed. He fired. The shot wasn't aimed to kill. It was aimed at Cain's hand. The bullet tore through flesh and bone, and Cain's revolver clattered to the ground. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. He stared at Jedediah, his eyes wide with disbelief and hatred. "You'll hang for this," he hissed, blood dripping from between his fingers. "They'll see you hang." Jedediah advanced, his face grim, the rifle held steady. He walked past the groaning sheriff, past the defiant girl standing like a small warrior with her makeshift weapon, and stopped in front of Cain. "Maybe," Jedediah said, his voice cold as a winter grave. "But you will never touch them again." He used the barrel of the rifle to push Cain backward, forcing him to stumble away from the house, away from the children he had terrorized. Behind him, Mara and Tess crept out onto the porch, their eyes wide. Mara was holding a heavy piece of firewood. Tess still clutched the small wooden horse, her knuckles white. They weren't just huddling anymore. They were standing their ground. Sheriff Brody pushed himself to his knees, his face a mixture of pain and astonishment. He looked from Jedediah's implacable form to the three girls lined up on the porch, a ragged but unbroken line of defense. He saw the iron skillet, the piece of firewood, the fierce determination in their eyes. He looked at Cain, who was whimpering now, his cruelty dissolved by pain. He saw the truth of the situation, a truth that no legal paper could obscure. This wasn't an obstruction of justice. This was a rescue. With a groan, Brody got to his feet. He ignored his own fallen pistol. He walked over to where Cain's revolver lay in the dust, picked it up, and tucked it into his belt. Then he walked over to Silas Cain. "Get on your horse," Brody said, his voice flat, all the condescension gone, replaced by a weary finality. "What?" Cain stared at him, incredulous. "You're taking his side." "I'm ending this," Brody said. He grabbed Cain by his good arm and hauled him toward his horse. "The report will say you came onto his property, drew a weapon, and he defended himself. It will say the children were not here. It will say you rode off. Now get out of my sight." He shoved Cain toward his horse. Cain, cradling his bleeding hand, shot a look of pure poison at Jedediah and the girls. He mounted up, his face contorted in a silent promise of future vengeance that they all knew was empty. He was broken. Brody watched him ride away until he was just a speck on the dark horizon. Then he turned back to Jedediah. There was a long, heavy silence. The aftermath of the violence hung in the air. The sun had fully set, and the first stars were appearing in the vast, velvet sky. Brody limped over and picked up his own pistol, holstering it without a word. He looked at the house, at the three girls standing together, and then at Jedediah. He saw the rifle, still held at the ready. He saw the exhaustion and the fierce, protective light in the man's eyes. He opened his mouth as if to say something, to enforce some final piece of the law, but he closed it again. There was nothing left to say. The law had failed here. Humanity had not. He simply nodded, a slow, tired acknowledgement. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving the four of them alone in the quiet darkness. Jedediah finally lowered the rifle. The strength seemed to drain out of him all at once. He leaned against a porch post, the adrenaline leaving him shaky and hollow. The girls didn't move. They just watched him. Eliza let the heavy skillet fall from her hand. It landed in the dust with a soft thud. He looked at them, Eliza, brave and fierce, Mara, quiet and strong, Tess, small and resolute. They were no longer wounded animals. They were survivors. He looked at the dark shape of the house, his house, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a fortress. A home. Tess took a tentative step forward. Then another. She walked right up to him and held out her hand. In her palm was the little wooden horse. His son's horse. She was giving it back. A gesture of ultimate trust. He reached out and gently closed her fingers back over the carving. "You keep it," he said, his voice thick. He would have wanted you to. Satir traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. And then she said a word he never thought he'd hear in this house again, a word that stitched together the shredded pieces of his heart. "Pa?" she asked, her voice small but clear as a bell. Jedediah knelt, the weight of his grief finally lifting, replaced by something new, something fragile but profoundly real. He looked at the three of them, his found family, and saw not just a reflection of what he had lost, but the promise of everything he had just found. The long, desolate night was over. The horizon was empty, and for the first time in forever, it looked like hope.